Hello, Brobs. We're back with more grandmother's stories. The stories of Emily Ward as conveyed by her stepdaughter, Frances Hurlbut. The Saginaw Indians. It was in the early summer of 1826, for I was 17 years old when this little incident happened, said Grandma in response to some questions of the children. It was training day, as it was called, and every man and boy who was well enough and old enough to carry a gun had to go to the county seat to be trained in military movements. That morning, Father and Eber and every man and boy in the settlement, except the poor lame shoemaker, had gone to Port Huron, 20 miles away to the training, and the women and children were left alone. But no one thought anything of it, for the country was at peace, and though there were Indians around, and they were friendly, and we had nothing to fear from them. It was a bright and lovely morning when we went down the river bank to see Father and Eber off. The river shone like a mirror and reflected the trees that overhung its banks so clearly that they looked like twin trees growing into its shining depths. The robins were singing their loudest, and everything was so fresh and beautiful and peaceful that I lingered a long time dreaming over it. But the cares of a housekeeper drove me home after a while, and I went into the house to do my morning work. I had put the house to rights and had just finished baking my bread when the door suddenly opened, and in poured a great number of Indians in full war paint and dress, muskets in their hands and knives and tomahawks in their belts. They paid no more attention to me than if I had been a block of wood, but went to the cupboard and took the bread and cake and everything eatable. They drank some vinegar there was in a barrel in the corner, and then began looking around after something in particular, but which they didn't find. Finally, one old fellow looked at me and said, "Whiskey." I shook my head and told him we hadn't any. He started to open the door into the room where the whiskey barrel was, but I stepped ahead of him quick, put my hand through the door handle, looked him right in the eye, and told him that he could not go in there. When they first came in, I seized the broom, as it was the only weapon left in the house, and a woman's weapon at that, said Grandma, smiling. And when some of the young men tried to pull me away from the door, I hung on tight with one hand and struck right and left with the broom handle as hard as I could strike, hitting an Indian at every blow. I knew I might as well die fighting as any other way, and that if I couldn't keep them from the whiskey barrel, they would get drunk and then kill every woman and child in the place. After a little, some of the young men made motions as if to strike me, but this old fellow, who seemed to be their chief, said in Indian, "Leave her to me, I'll put her to sleep." I knew what he meant, for I could understand Indian some, but I made up my mind that I'd not let go of that door as long as I had life to hold it. Then the old Indian made as if to strike me with a stick, but I didn't flinch, and kept on looking him right in the eye. Then he threw it down on the floor and said, "Pick it up." I knew that if I stooped, he would strike me on the back of the head, and that I would die without making any outcry. So I shook my head and would not pick it up. In the meantime, I could hear Sally screaming and crying in the yard, for the young Indians were amusing themselves, beating her with long, slender whips for no other purpose than the fun of hearing her scream. But just at that moment, she put her head in at the door, and I shouted to her, "Sally, run quick and tell the men." Now I knew that there were no men around but the lame old shoemaker, but I said it for a double purpose, one to get Sally away, and the other that the old Indian, who understood a little English, might think there were a good many men around, and so go away for fear of them. Sally ran quick as a flash, and the old fellow, who had understood what I said, as I expected he would, left me and began talking in a low tone with some of the older Indians. They seemed to come to some sudden decision, for he gave a word of command, and they all left the house as abruptly as they had entered it, went down the bank, got into their boats, pushed off into the river, and were halfway across before Sally got back with the news that the shoemaker was afraid and would not come. "Oh, Grandma, weren't you afraid?" said the children. "No, though I knew they might kill me, I didn't seem to have any fear. I remember I thought I might just as well be killed after they got drunk. As after they got drunk. But after they were gone, I was so weak and trembled, so I could not stand up. I had to sit down, and I shook like a leaf in the wind for hours after. It took me several days to get over the nervous depression that followed. "Oh, Grandma, I think you were awfully brave," said Goldenhair. "No, it wasn't bravery," replied Grandma thoughtfully. "I was afraid they would get the whiskey and then kill everybody." "What made them go away so quick?" inquired one of the mamas. "You see," said Grandma, "these Indians were warriors from the Saginaw tribe who were very fierce and warlike, and they were then on their way to Detroit to try and release from prison their chief, old Kishkako, who had a year before killed a man in the streets of Detroit. Just in pure wantonness, without the least provocation, he had thrown a tomahawk at a white man who was walking peacefully along and struck him down. He had been arrested, tried, and condemned to be hanged. The Indians thought it an overwhelming disgrace to be hung like dogs, as they said, and they determined if they couldn't release him to give him poison. I suppose the reason they went when I told Sally to run after the men was that, going for the purpose they didn't wish anything to defeat that purpose. They were afraid that if the men there would be a fight, and they would be delayed and perhaps stopped altogether. "It was lucky," said one of the aunties, "that they didn't know there was but one man in the place." "Yes, indeed," cried the children. "What became of Kishkako?" asked one of the mamas. "He took poison the morning he was to be hanged. They found the white man's government too strong for them to rescue him, so they gave him the poison." And then we suddenly go into a poem to Emily Ward, 1826. "Oh, brave young maid, I see thee stand with arm thrust through the iron latchet of the door, facing 100 foes with eyes that wore the high and holy look that fears no harm for self. What stayed their hands? What did disarm their murderous will? And though the hand was raised to slay a drop supine, dear God be praised, and saved that noble life. What but the charm that bravery hath for savage men? They love the lofty mind, disdaining life and pain. O heaven-sent girl, when was thy duty ever with thy will at strife? Bright the day and joyous for thee, and filled with beauty, if only those lovest walked in thy way." Francis Hurlbut, 1889. And that's all, bruv, for today. Goodbye.